Imagine waking up one morning to discover that nearly every field around your village has turned black. The crop your family depends on, the food that keeps your children alive, the harvest that will carry you through the winter, is rotting beneath the soil. At first, people believed it was only a bad season. Surely next year's harvest would recover. But it didn't. Instead, the mysterious disease returned. Again. And again. Within a few years, over 1 million people would die from starvation and disease. Another million would leave their homeland forever. And Ireland would be changed in ways that can still be seen today. The tragedy became known as the Great Irish Famine, or in Irish, An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. It remains one of the most devastating humanitarian disasters in modern European history. But how did a failure of one crop lead to the collapse of an entire society? To answer that question, we must first understand Ireland before the famine. In the early 19th century, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, following the Act of Union of 1801. Although politically united with Britain, Ireland remained very different economically and socially. Around 8 million people lived on the island, making it one of the most densely populated parts of Europe. Most lived in rural communities. Large factories and industrial cities, common in Britain, were far less common in Ireland. Instead, the country relied heavily on agriculture. Yet the land was not owned by most of the people who worked it. Much of Ireland was controlled by wealthy landlords, many of whom were members of the Protestant Anglo-Irish elite. Some lived in Ireland, but many were absentee landlords living in Britain, leaving agents to manage their estates. Tenant farmers rented small plots of land. If they failed to pay rent, they risked eviction. For many families, there was little security. Today, it may seem strange that one crop could sustain an entire population. But the potato was uniquely suited to 19th century Ireland. Introduced from the Americas centuries earlier, potatoes grew well in Ireland's cool, damp climate. Even on small plots of poor quality land, they produced large harvests. One variety, known as the Irish lumper, became especially common. Although it lacked genetic diversity and was vulnerable to disease, it produced enough calories to feed large families. A small piece of land planted with potatoes could support parents and several children. Combined with a little milk or buttermilk, potatoes provided many of the nutrients people needed to survive. For millions of tenant farmers, potatoes were not simply a favorite food. They were the foundation of everyday life. This dependence, however, created a dangerous vulnerability. If the potato failed, millions would have no alternative food source. Most Irish farming families lived modestly. Their homes were often simple cottages built from stone or mud, with thatched roofs made from straw or reeds. Furniture was limited. Many households consisted of a single room shared by parents, children, and sometimes livestock. Life revolved around the seasons: planting, harvesting, preparing for winter. Children worked alongside adults from an early age. Despite hardship, many communities developed strong traditions of music, storytelling, language, and faith. Family and neighbors often supported one another during difficult times. But even before the famine, poverty was widespread. A failed harvest, illness, or loss of employment could push families into crisis. The margin between survival and disaster was already very thin. The conditions that existed before the famine have long been the subject of historical debate. Many historians argue that Ireland's social and economic structure left millions especially vulnerable. Large quantities of agricultural products, including grain, livestock, and butter, continued to be produced in Ireland, much of it for commercial markets. At the same time, many poorer rural families depended heavily on potatoes for their own food. This contrast has become one of the most discussed aspects of the famine. Scholars continue to debate the extent to which government policy, land ownership, economic systems, and natural causes each contributed to the scale of the disaster. Understanding this broader context is essential to understanding why the famine became so catastrophic. In the summer of 1845, farmers noticed something unusual. Healthy green potato plants began to change. Dark patches appeared on the leaves, stems turned black. A strange smell spread through the fields. When farmers dug into the soil, they found potatoes soft, brown, and rotten. The crop seemed to decay almost overnight. The cause was Phytophthora infestans, a microorganism commonly known as potato blight. Modern science classifies it as an umicete, a fungus-like organism rather than a true fungus. It spreads rapidly in cool, damp weather. Once established, entire fields can be destroyed within days. In 1845, however, farmers had no understanding of plant diseases or microorganisms. They could only watch as their harvest disappeared. By autumn 1845, approximately one-third of Ireland's potato crop had been destroyed. The damage was serious, but many hoped the following year's harvest would recover. British Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel recognized that the situation might become dangerous. His government quietly imported Indian corn, often called maize, from the United States to help relieve food shortages. Peel also established scientific investigations to better understand the disease. These actions provided some assistance, but they could not replace the enormous quantity of food that had been lost. Across Ireland, anxiety spread. Families carefully rationed what remained. Some sold possessions to buy food. Others borrowed money, hoping next year's harvest would restore normal life. No one yet realized that the worst was still to come. When farmers planted potatoes again in 1846, optimism briefly returned. Fresh green plants emerged across the countryside. Perhaps the previous year's disaster had been an isolated event. Then the blight returned. This time, it was even more destructive. Within weeks, vast areas of the potato crop were devastated. Fields that had promised hope once again became fields of decay. The consequences were immediate. Families who had exhausted their savings after the first failed harvest now had almost nothing left. Food prices rose sharply. Work became scarce. Hunger spread from village to village. What had begun as an agricultural crisis was becoming a humanitarian catastrophe. By the end of 1846, Ireland was facing a disaster unlike anything in its modern history. The potato crop had failed for a second consecutive year. For millions of tenant farmers and laborers, there was simply no food left. Families who had once harvested enough potatoes to survive the winter now dug through empty fields, hoping to find even a few edible tubers that had escaped the blight. Many found only black, foul-smelling masses of rot. Livestock had already been sold to pay rent or buy food. Household possessions were traded for bread or grain. When those resources were exhausted, countless families had nothing left to exchange. Hunger spread across the countryside. Entire villages fell silent as people weakened from lack of food. The British government attempted several forms of relief, but historians continue to debate whether these efforts were adequate for the scale of the crisis. Under Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, emergency maize imports had helped ease shortages during the first year of the blight. However, Peel's government fell in 1846, and Lord John Russell became Prime Minister. His administration relied more heavily on the principles of free market economics and existing poor law institutions. The government expanded public works programs, employing hundreds of thousands of people to build roads and other infrastructure in exchange for wages. In theory, workers could then buy food. In practice, the system often struggled. Many laborers were already too weak from hunger to perform physically demanding work. Payments were sometimes delayed. Projects were poorly organized. By early 1847, the public works system was largely abandoned in favor of soup kitchens, which provided millions of meals during the height of the crisis. Although these kitchens temporarily reduced starvation in many areas, they were intended as emergency measures rather than long-term solutions. For many families, the only remaining option was the workhouse. Established under the Irish Poor Law, workhouses were designed to provide shelter and food for the poorest members of society. They were never intended to accommodate the enormous numbers created by the famine. As hunger intensified, workhouses became dangerously overcrowded. Entire families shared cramped rooms. Sanitation deteriorated. Clean water was often limited. Disease spread rapidly. Many people entered believing they would find safety. Instead, some encountered illness that proved just as deadly as starvation itself. Conditions varied from one institution to another, but throughout Ireland, the system was overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe. Although the famine is remembered for hunger, disease claimed an enormous number of lives. Malnutrition weakened the body's natural defenses. Once people became severely undernourished, infections spread quickly. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, cholera. These illnesses swept through villages, workhouses, hospitals, and relief centers. Doctors and nurses often worked tirelessly, despite limited medical knowledge and scarce resources. Some contracted the diseases themselves while caring for patients. In many communities, there were not enough healthy people left to bury the dead. The combination of starvation and epidemic disease transformed a crop failure into one of Europe's greatest humanitarian disasters. As the crisis deepened, many tenant farmers could no longer pay rent. Some landlords reduced rents or contributed to relief efforts. Others, facing financial pressures of their own or believing smaller farms were no longer economically viable, carried out large-scale evictions. Families were forced to leave cottages they had occupied for generations. Roofs were sometimes removed to prevent abandoned homes from being reoccupied. With nowhere else to go, many displaced families sought shelter in workhouses, roadside ditches, or makeshift camps. The loss of a home often meant the loss of community, employment, and any remaining hope of recovery. For countless families, the only perceived chance of survival was emigration. Ships departed from Irish ports carrying passengers to Britain, Canada, the United States, and Australia. The journeys were long, crowded, and dangerous. Many emigrants traveled on vessels that later became known as coffin ships. The name reflected the terrible conditions reported on some voyages. Passengers were packed into confined spaces with limited ventilation. Food and clean water were often scarce. Disease spread rapidly during Atlantic crossings. Not every emigrant ship experienced catastrophic conditions, but mortality rates on some voyages were tragically high. For many passengers, leaving Ireland meant saying goodbye to family, language, and homeland, perhaps forever. Those who survived the crossing often began entirely new lives overseas. By 1848, the effects of the famine were visible across Ireland. Some villages had lost much of their population. Fields once cultivated by thousands of small farmers lay abandoned. Schools closed, businesses disappeared, churches held funeral after funeral. The country's population, which had been growing for generations, began a dramatic decline. The famine did not simply take lives, it reshaped the demographic future of Ireland. In many regions, emigration continued long after the worst years of the famine had passed. Generations of Irish families established new communities abroad, particularly in cities such as New York, Boston, Montreal, and Liverpool. Their descendants would carry Irish traditions across the world. Statistics help us understand the scale of the famine. But behind every number was a person. A mother dividing the last piece of bread among her children. A father leaving home alone in search of work. A child waiting at a harbor, uncertain whether they would ever see their grandparents again. Letters sent from America spoke of hope, but also of heartbreak. Some emigrants promised to return once they had earned enough money. Many never did. Entire families were permanently separated by an ocean. The famine became not only a demographic disaster, but also a deeply personal tragedy, experienced by millions of individuals. By 1852, the worst years of the Great Irish Famine had come to an end. The potato blight became less destructive and harvest gradually improved. But Ireland was no longer the same country. Entire villages had disappeared. Thousands of cottages stood abandoned. Fields that had once supported large farming families lay empty. The population, which had been over 8 million before the famine, had fallen dramatically through death and emigration. Even after the famine officially ended, Ireland's population continued to decline for decades as many young people chose, or felt compelled, to leave in search of better opportunities abroad. The scars of the famine did not disappear with the return of the harvest. For many families, the tragedy had become a permanent part of their history. One of the famine's most lasting consequences was the creation of a vast Irish diaspora. Millions of Irish emigrants and their descendants settled across the world. In the United States, Irish communities grew rapidly in cities such as New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Others settled in Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. Life in these new countries was rarely easy. Many immigrants arrived with little money. They faced prejudice, difficult working conditions, and the challenge of adapting to unfamiliar societies. Yet they also built churches, schools, businesses, newspapers, and community organizations. Over time, Irish immigrants and their descendants became influential in politics, industry, science, literature, and public life. Today, tens of millions of people around the world trace at least part of their ancestry to Ireland. The famine also transformed Irish politics. Many people believe that the British government's response had been inadequate. Others argued that officials had been overwhelmed by an unprecedented agricultural disaster. These competing interpretations remain part of historical debate today. What is beyond dispute is that the famine profoundly affected relations between Ireland and Britain. The catastrophe strengthened demands for political reform, greater Irish self-government, and changes to land ownership. Over the following decades, movements advocating land reform, home rule, and eventually Irish independence gained increasing support. Although these developments had many causes, the memory of the famine became a powerful influence in Irish political life. For generations, it shaped how many people understood the relationship between Ireland and the British state. Few historical events have generated as much discussion as the Irish Potato Famine. One common misconception is that Ireland had no food during the famine. The reality is more complex. Food continued to be produced in Ireland, including grain and livestock, much of it destined for commercial markets. Historians continue to debate the extent to which different economic policies, property rights, and market structures influenced access to food during the crisis. Another misconception is that the potato blight alone explains the scale of the disaster. The blight triggered the famine, but many scholars argue that pre-existing poverty, dependence on a single crop, land tenure systems, and policy decisions all contributed to the severity of the tragedy. In other words, the famine was both a natural disaster and a human crisis. Understanding both aspects is essential for understanding history. Perhaps the most sensitive question surrounding the famine is who bears responsibility. Historians have offered different interpretations. Some emphasize the unprecedented nature of the potato blight and the limits of 19th century science and government. Others argue that political choices, economic ideology, and administrative failures significantly worsened the suffering. There is no single historical consensus that fully resolves this debate. What historians broadly agree upon is that the response to the famine has remained one of the most closely examined aspects of 19th century British and Irish history. It continues to be studied because it raises enduring questions about government responsibility during humanitarian crises. Across Ireland and around the world, memorials now honor those who suffered during the famine. Statues depicting families carrying their few possessions stand in cities including Dublin, Cork, Boston, New York, and Toronto. Museums preserve personal letters, household objects, and official records from the period. Annual commemorations remember not only those who died but also those forced to leave their homeland. For descendants of famine survivors, these memorials represent resilience as much as loss. They remind future generations that behind every statistic was a human life. The Irish potato famine continues to be studied by historians, economists, public health experts, and policymakers. It demonstrates the dangers of relying too heavily on a single staple crop. It highlights how poverty can magnify the effects of natural disasters. It also illustrates the importance of effective disaster relief, public health measures, and responsive government during humanitarian emergencies. Many of these lessons remain relevant today as countries confront challenges such as food insecurity, climate change, crop diseases, and forced migration. History cannot change the past, but it can help societies prepare for the future. The Great Irish Famine was far more than a failed harvest. It was a catastrophe that reshaped a nation. Beginning with the arrival of potato blight in 1845, the disaster unfolded over several years, bringing hunger, disease, eviction, and mass emigration. More than 1 million people are estimated to have died, while roughly another million left Ireland, creating one of the largest waves of migration in modern history. Its effects can still be seen today, not only in Ireland's population and politics, but also in Irish communities across the globe. The famine remains a subject of careful historical research because it sits at the intersection of environmental disaster, social inequality, public policy, and human resilience. For those who lived through it, it was remembered simply as the Great Hunger. For those who lived through it, it was remembered simply as the Great Hunger. For the world, it stands as a lasting reminder that the greatest tragedies are rarely caused by a single event alone. They emerge when natural disasters, human decisions, and social vulnerability collide. Nearly 2 centuries later, the voices of those who endured the famine continue to echo through history, calling on future generations to remember, to study, and to learn.